This is Canada Reads American Style, featuring two friends who love Canada Reads and Canadian literature. Welcome our host Rebecca from Michigan and Tara from Ontario. Hi everyone, it is Rebecca, and today I am speaking with professional adventurer Adam Shoalts, who has been declared one of the, quote, greatest living explorers by Canadian Geographic and named, quote, Canada's Indiana Jones by the Toronto Star. As everyone should know by now, Adam is one of Canada's best-selling authors, and he is here today to discuss his sixth book, Vanished Beyond the Map, The Mystery of Lost Explorer Hubert Darrell. Welcome back to the podcast, Adam.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me back on.
And I just want to mention that I appreciate you taking time because you are on book tour right now, and I know your schedule is really crazy. And I just wanted to do a quick shout out for anyone who is interested. Check out Adam's book tour schedule. My friends Andrew, Anne, and I went to his presentation in Sarnia. We were front row center. It is fascinating. It is compelling. It is hilarious. And Adam, you are a great storyteller in the written word and in public presentations. We had a fantastic time.
Well, thank you very much.
So let's go ahead and just get right down to the nitty gritty here. Can you tell us about your new book and how you came to write it?
Right. Well, the new book is called Vanish Beyond the Map, The Mystery of Lost Explorer Hubert Darrell. And it is indeed about a lost explorer who vanished in Canada's Arctic over 100 years ago. I had done many expeditions all across Canada's north for different purposes, simply long journeys, like a 4,000 kilometer journey across the north. I'd look for peregrine falcons, endangered species, archaeological sites. But at the back of my mind while doing all those adventures, I had this one name that had haunted me for years, and that was the name of Hubert Darrell. Now, this isn't a name that you would find in any history book or even in a Wikipedia page. But believe it or not, Hubert Darrell was once regarded as maybe the greatest of all Arctic explorers, even though today he's been entirely forgotten. Not one in a million knows his name. At least maybe if my book gets better known, that'll change. But up until the point I wrote the book, not one in a million had ever heard of this guy. And I thought that's astonishing. Who was he and what happened to him? Well, he was a legend, as I said, in the Arctic. He had pulled off many incredible journeys, traveling thousands of kilometers in all kinds of conditions in the dead of winter alone, without even a sled dog for a companion. Many of the biggest names in the Arctic, explorers like Amundsen, Stephenson, they were almost in awe of Darrell's abilities. And then in 1910, suddenly he disappeared. He disappeared in a very remote area of the Arctic because he was one man. No rescue party was ever sent. No search expedition was ever mounted. And gradually, as the years passed, his memory faded and he was forgotten. But I had stumbled upon him almost by luck. I was just reading about Canada's North, as I often do in preparation for my own expeditions, and I'd found almost like a passing reference to him as this forgotten giant of the North. And I thought, well, this is intriguing. And I learned that he had sent letters from the North to some of his family members, his siblings and others. And I was able to obtain copies of those letters. And then using his letters and even one of his journals that had survived, I planned expeditions of my own to retrace his routes, to search for his old campsites, and if I could, unravel his mystery, try to figure out what actually happened to him. So in a nutshell, that is the story of the new book, Vanish Beyond the Map.
And I just want to say, too, that there are so many layers to this story, and it takes you through an amazing winding trail of adventure and research and details that you will absolutely love. So I always say every time you write a book, it's my favorite, but I'm not kidding. This one really was my favorite, I think, again, this time. Anyway, on page 30, you write, Darrell likely discovered he was one of those happy mortals who are born with an innate sense of direction, the ability to wander at will through dense forest, icy mountains, and featureless tundra without losing one's way. And I was just curious if you are one of those happy mortals.
Well, maybe. I don't travel so much in the dead of winter when, there's no sunrise at those latitudes in Arctic Canada. It can be dark for literally 24 hours, and that can last for months, depending on your exact latitude. I can't claim very much personal experience wandering across the Arctic in the dead of winter. I've done it in the summer, and in the summer it can still be confusing, especially when it's foggy or misty. I mean, some days when I was traveling by canoe across the Arctic, it was so foggy I couldn't see more than a few feet. I mean, I think I think I'm pretty good at navigating by canoe in 3 months of the year. In the winter, that gets a little more challenging. I mean, yeah, I would say you can't really do what my line of work is, leading expeditions for the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, and not be, at least minimally competent with navigation. So I'm pretty good at it. And I guess it is something you pick up intuitively. I mean, I wander the woods all the time. I'm very lucky where I live in Canada. I'm surrounded by forests, so I'm always out in the woods. And I think if you do that enough, pretty much anyone could develop a knack for it. You get to recognize every little landmark and you start to think of them as distinct, whether it's like a particular, oh, look at that old walnut tree or that particular rock. And sometimes I'll just sort of name the feature in my head, even when I'm doing a canoe journey. And it helps you to sort of memorize where you've been. And also, if you've been studying a map ahead of time, sort of helps that map stay fresh in your mind so that you can visualize what you saw on the map and now how it actually looks in real life. Darrell definitely had this ability to an unusual degree, even by the standards of his time. In fact, he was such a master of his art of navigating, of wandering, that the Mounties in the Yukon, they hired Darrell to lead them, to lead their dog sled patrols in the winter, often in blinding blizzards where the snow was so thick you could barely see 5 feet in any direction. Darrell's job was to lead the Mounties all the way from Dawson City, hundreds of miles north, across the mountains, through the Arctic snows, to a little tiny fur trade post called Fort McPherson, which is above the Arctic Circle. And Darrell did this without a hitch, without a misstep. He navigated with his almost superhuman abilities in all kinds of conditions, and he did it on foot. He would go ahead on foot using his iron stamina. I mean, people were blown away by his incredible physical stamina, but he would travel on foot to break the snow or break the trail through the deep snow so the huskies, the sled dogs, could follow behind him. And he was covering immense distances in a single day, sometimes like 50 miles on foot. So needless to say, his abilities fast became legend all across the North. And he eventually got to a point where he was in high demand, even though the outside world didn't know his name. Across the North, from Alaska to Hudson's Bay, there were many who wanted him to be their guide, right, to lead them. Mounties, fur trappers, prospectors, even many of the indigenous people he crossed paths with actually invited him to hunt with them, to travel with them. So he was clearly a man of remarkable abilities, and he became well known across the North, which to me only added to his mystery that he had seemingly disappeared. No one really knew what the story was. Did he do it voluntarily? Did something happen to him? Was there a tragic accident, something darker? Had he been murdered? No one really had any idea. He just simply disappeared as if into thin air. But all this was part of the mystery that lured me into his story.
Oh, that's amazing. And the other thing that you mentioned too was he really became part of the indigenous community in terms of how he dressed or his communication skills, et cetera. And I really love that part of it as well, because he wasn't one of these explorers who tried to impose his will on the environment. He learned how to adapt through others who live there.
Right. And as I point out in the book, through his letters, he strongly opposed any sort of movement to assimilate indigenous people. He thought that that was morally wrong and just foolhardy. He didn't like that. He actually wanted traditional cultures to survive, to go on. He thought that trying to assimilate was the wrong idea. But he's a fascinating character. He came from a very humble background. His family didn't have a lot of money. The idea of going to university was something that was never even remotely in a million years in his future. And he had to leave home at 16. Yet in spite of that, he had a quick mind. And he ended up learning to speak at least 3 or 4 different languages, including various indigenous languages spoken in the North, like Athabascan. And yes, that's where he learned a lot of his survival skills in the North. He was a guy who wanted to learn everything he could. And because he had so many experiences as a wanderer in the Klondike Gold Rush, as a fur trapper, as a prospector, he did acquire a lot of knowledge. And his knowledge was really impressive. And this was something I tried to get across in the book as well, using his letters and his journals wherever I could. But I guess just to say one final point on his uncanny ability to navigate, a lot of that came from his coming of age as a teenager. in Manitoba, where he lived on the northern Canadian prairies, what we call the prairies in Canada, what I guess you guys would call the Great Plains.
Hmm.
But that's the 1800s. And in Canada, if you've been to Manitoba in the winter, it looks a lot like the Arctic. The plains are just widespread, open, and devoid of trees. So it's really a landscape with very few features. And Darrell got used to it, even at a young age, as a teenager, wandering across that on snowshoes in the dead of winter. I mean, his nearest neighbor was often more than a mile away, so it was a pretty isolated place. And he became habituated to that kind of lifestyle at a young age. And I think that was partly what gave him his amazing ability at navigating. And that served him well in future years as he became, many would say, the greatest of all wanderers across the North.
Yeah. And one of the things you just alluded to is you did amazing primary research. And so as a research geek myself, I loved hearing about the various places you visited in uncovering details about Darrell's life. And can you mention a few of the highlights of discovery?
Right. So I spent years. I mean, I'd actually had intended to write this book sooner than I did. I didn't think it was going to get published in 2025. I originally thought I would publish it like 5 years ago. But I really wanted to leave no stone unturned. I wanted to do all the research I could. That took me down multiple rabbit holes, everything from visiting remote communities across the Canadian Arctic and interviewing the most elderly members of that community I could find and say, okay, Darrell disappeared in 1910. So even if you're 115 years old, you'd still be too young to have ever known him. But maybe there's a chance that some sort of oral memory might have been passed down, some sort of folk tale, any sort of family lore. Perhaps you remember this lone wolf, this wanderer, or if not that, in Manitoba, I thought maybe I could find someone who knew Darrell's brother, his fiance, any sort of string connecting the present to the past. I went and looked for, including the ruins of his old farmstead. I wanted to find that in Manitoba. I went to look for the ruins of his cabin in a super remote place in the Canadian North. I wandered the wilderness for months looking for his old trails. I mean, the Arctic is amazing. It's like a time capsule. Because of how cold it is there, everything preserves so well. So you can cut a stump, and 100 years later, that stump will remain. Of course, at a more southern latitude like Michigan, with the humidity in July and August, that's not the case. The stump would long since have rotten away. Even if you drop a pocket knife, I mean, you're not likely to find it 100 years later in somewhere like Michigan, where the landscape will change, right? That could be buried beneath a McDonald's parking lot now. But in the North, it's amazing, right? It's everything is largely the way it looked 115 years ago. So I knew that it's still possible to go up into the mountains of Alaska or the Yukon and find a fur trapper's log cabin from 100 years ago. And I'd seen the ruins and relics of these places with my own eyes. And that's what I was really looking for with Darrell. I thought the more of his old footsteps I can personally retrace, the better positioned I will be to try to figure out what had happened to him. There must be an answer out there somewhere in the wild. That's what I believed. And that was really the basis that led me on for years. It became almost like an obsession, trying to track down any trace of Darrell. And I found all kinds of traces. For example, in the book, I talk about stumbling upon his portrait. And this was a big moment for me because for years I'd been reading his letters, but I didn't know what he looked like because not being famous, he didn't have any images on the internet or in any museum. No one even really knew what he looked like. And then finally, almost by sheer luck, just as I was getting ready to embark on my own solo journey across the Arctic, I came across a portrait of Darrell in the most unlikely of places in a tavern in the Yukon. And I had chills, like goosebumps when I saw it. I'm like, could this really be the man who I've studied for years looking back at me in this photograph? He had like piercing eyes and it was like almost like looking at a ghost. That in itself, though, led me on another chase to figure out whether or not this is an authentic portrait. I mean, how do I know that this isn't just some random person's grandfather that they stuck in the tavern and said, I don't know who that is, just write down Hubert Darrell, right? But I was able to authenticate the photograph. It led me back to Manitoba, and I determined that, yeah, this is basically from one of Darrell's friends in Manitoba, tracked this down. I could even identify what year it was taken, almost certainly when he was either 30 or 31 years of age back in his hometown of Bernal, Manitoba. So, yeah, it's amazing when you go down those rabbit holes. What an adventure researching a ghost of the past can really become. And that was the case with Darrell. I mean, it went from everything from enduring storms in the Arctic, paddling through wild canyons, down wilderness rivers, and, coming face to face with grizzly bears and polar bears, to spending weeks looking through archival documents with a magnifying glass, trying to make out the handwriting in a letter from over 100 years ago that had faded, trying to figure out, is this the clue I need to unravel his mystery? So yeah, it was all part of this adventure, figuring out and investigating his story and his disappearance.
I have a question that I personally would have an answer for, but I'm curious if you do, which is, if you had an opportunity to meet Hubert Darrell now, are there any burning questions about his life that you would like him to answer?
I don't know. I'd probably ask that the big one that comes to mind is whether or not in the book, I mean, on my expedition in the wilderness, I went back again and again. And finally, I located what I'm pretty sure was his last campsite, where Hubert Darrell met his epic end, where the end of his journey happened. And I found his final campsite, and putting all the pieces of the puzzle together, some really important clues I'd uncovered in the archives with what I actually saw in the wilderness, I arrived at a conclusion that I think is pretty definite of what actually happened to him. And it was something very dramatic, a very tragic end, which I won't say because that would spoil the book and half
Correct.
the fun of reading it. But I guess I would ask him, hey, did I get it right? Is this what really happened to you? And if I got it right, that would be very satisfying. But if not, I'd want to know. So yeah, I guess it would be like, was I close to the truth? Is this what ended up happening? There's a part of the book at the end there where I've reconstructed his final days, right, using all the evidence I've found, and I want to know how close to the truth is that. I think it is, based on all the evidence, multiple strains, different contemporary accounts. That is what had happened. But that would be my burning question. I would ask him if it were possible.
And my burning question would be, I'm just fascinated by, and you told this story so well, which is, there was this real push-pull for him. He kept saying to his family that he's going to go back to Manitoba and help his brother with the farm, and yet he couldn't do it. He just needed to be out wandering and living his best life for himself. And I guess that's what I would ask him, is how much did he want to really live the life he led, and that push pull that he had to try to go back to the farm, which that was not who he was. And I just want to know more about, like, the psychological part of his, just that process of which way to go.
Right. Yeah, I think that's something I can identify with personally, so I wouldn't ask him.
Oh.
Uh, that's the call of the wild, though, right? That's what Jack London wrote about in the poet Robert Service in the Yukon. And Robert Service, the famous poet, he knew Darrell personally in the Yukon, and it's quite likely that Darrell was the direct inspiration for many of Robert Service's poems about the spell of the North, the spell of the Yukon, the call of the wild, and how it's this irresistible thing. How, many individuals such as Hubert Darrell on paper said, I want to go back to the farm, I want to settle down. And yet somehow, almost as if it was, depending on your point of view, a curse, a spell, a charm, they just couldn't seem to break away. It's this strange irony, this paradox. In spite of all the danger, the hardships, conditions down to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, blinding blizzards, frostbite, impossible physical labor crossing these mountains, what is it that's so strangely captivating about it? Not everyone felt that charm. Many of the thousands who went north during the Klondike Gold Rush, they quit at the earliest opportunity. They turned their backs on the North, never to return. But Darrell was one of those who was almost enchanted by it, right? Almost as if under a trance. He couldn't quite break away, despite, as you said, Rebecca, writing in his letters to his family that he wanted to come home. And I think his heart was divided. I mean, I think that's the true of many of us, that we wish we could be in two places at once. Now, he did go back to Manitoba at one point when his brother said, the horses on the farm have died. We had crop failures. We're really in a bad shape. And Darrell couldn't abandon his brother in his hour of need. He went back there. But Darrell was also under this strange spell of the North and compelled to wander to ever more remote places, like thousands of miles from the nearest town, very deep into uncharted territory. And he was compelled by it. And I think, partly it's that fascination of the unknown. And when you've been out there, you get a taste for it. And in Darrell's case, too, having been born in the world of the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution, he had seen poverty, he had seen incredible hardship. So there was something about the wilderness that offered him freedom, a freedom that he couldn't find anywhere else. And this is something that many others have felt down through history. It's why many people in American history went to the frontier. Yes, it was full of danger, but there was something about being out there. You could be your own master, beholden to none, answerable only to yourself, that many found strangely compelling. In spite of the danger, in spite of the hardship, he was his own master. He was free to wander where he pleased, no one to pay rent to, not to be in debt to anyone. He could camp under the stars every night somewhere new, seeing incredible sights, the northern lights, the most breathtaking views, beautiful mountains, lakes. So all of that got into his soul, it got into his blood, and ultimately it proved his tragic downfall, almost like a Shakespearean figure. He just was like a moth drawn to the flame. He couldn't say no until it led him on greater and greater journeys, until finally it proved his undoing. So it's all a very tragic story, how it unfolded. And of course, as you know from reading the book, he even had, to make it even more tragic, he had a fiancée who, by all accounts, he was madly in love with and wanting to get back to. And I think in his heart, he hoped that he would eventually make his name in the North, find some way to save up enough money so that he could marry and settle down and establish a life. But alas, it was not to be.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the reasons this is my favorite book, and I've read all 6 of your books, I've loved them all, and each time I read the next one, I say, "This is my favorite." But here's what I really love most about this particular book, is that you have restored a notable explorer to a place in history, and I just wanna know how that feels to know it's like you said, more can come out about him perhaps, that people will start to look a little closer, and how does it feel to be his, champion?
Well, I mean, I guess it's good, but it's not. I mean, yes, that is good, and I'm glad you've enjoyed the book. But in the same light, I think if you look at all 6 of my books, I'm continuing a theme where I'm always drawn to the obscure, the unknown, right? That's what I've tried to
Mhm.
do in each of my books in different ways. For example, another of my books, The Whisper on the Night Wind, which if we were talking last week, I would have said was perfect for the time of year, Halloween. But that's
Yeah.
also an obscure mystery from out of the pages of the Canadian wilderness, this legendary sort of, a bump in the night, cryptozoology, whatever you want to call it, a folklore story from Canada's wilderness that wasn't well known at all. I mean, everyone knows Bigfoot and Sasquatch and maybe Wendigo, but this was something entirely different, and yet so rich in the history, in the historical sources that have been forgotten, slipped through the cracks, that I wanted to bring it to light. And my first book, Alone Against the North, was about doing the same thing, but with geography.
Yeah.
Forgotten Places, History of Canada in 10 Maps brings out a lot of fascinating stories from Canada's history that weren't well known. And my longer journeys, those books, Where the Falcon Flies and Beyond the Trees, were
Oh.
more about shedding lights on particular landscapes and places that few people know, even places where many people pass by, but they're not necessarily slowing down to observe or look closely. So I think to a certain extent, to come back to your question, Rebecca, I mean, obviously, I'm happy that the book is still quite new. It's only 4 weeks old, but I'm happy that it seems to be finding an audience and people seem to be enjoying it. It reached #1 on the bestseller list in Canada, which Canada is not nearly as big as the US, but here in Canada, that does feel nice to know that Hubert Darrell is slowly coming out of the shadows and getting his due. And yeah, if he gets his credit, that will be all to the good, and I'll be happy to see that happen. But ultimately, I wrote the book because I think it is just a fascinating adventure story, one of the most epic stories in the history of the North, the life of Hubert Darrell. There's so much incredible drama, survival, shipwreck, getting stuck in an igloo, having one of his companions mysteriously murdered and left for dead on an ice floe. The story itself is just so full of drama that I thought it's something that people will enjoy. They want to hear this. And if, as a bonus, I can also make Hubert Darrell take his place in the history books, so much the good, right?
Absolutely. That's what I loved about it. So now I'm going to switch a little bit, not really, but a little bit, which is in all of your books, you mention the need to preserve the northern wilderness. And I was just wondering, Are things getting better with regard to that preservation? Are they getting worse? Is it staying the same? You've seen a lot of change, I'm sure, over the years that you've been doing all your explorations. And I was just curious kind of how you feel about that at this point.
Well, I always like to be an optimist and project positivity, but this is a hard one to do with any kind of positive spin. The answer to your question, I'm sad to say, is definitely no. Things are getting much worse from an environmental, from a conservation perspective. We're losing more and more wild places at a relentless pace. Not every year, not every month, but every day, I would say. We're just building more roads into the heart of the north, into the heart of wild areas. I mean, it's the same story all over the world, whether you're talking about the Canadian Arctic, Michigan, Alaska, Australia. The human demand for resources is just it's never ending, right? It's just an expanding ecological footprint. And that's something, even in my own brief lifetime, I have witnessed places that have remained very remote, pristine. And then almost overnight, it's like we built a uranium mine there. We opened up a new highway there. We logged out this last virgin old growth forest. And I know it seems strange in a book about a lost explorer. Why am I even talking about these things? But all of my books have a special afterword that is really a plea for preservation of wild places and wildlife. And I offer different reasons, but ultimately to me, that's my central motivation. I mean, I'm looking out my window right now as I'm speaking to you at a forest, and trying to protect that forest, I think, is an essential. I think it does us all good, even if you never even go and wander that wilderness. Just having it there, I think, in a deep level, it does the soul good to have those places. It's a mistake, I think, to pave it all over. And I say, if Hubert Darrell was here today, I think he would tell us the real rare gem he was seeking all those years wasn't gold. It was the wild itself, the call of the wild. And nowadays, in the year 2025, in a world that's becoming ever more digital, ever more urban, I think we have more need of those places than ever before. So if it was up to me, I would be preserving pretty much all I could of the wilderness, everything that is left. Sadly, though, that viewpoint in Canada in recent years has really gone out of style. I mean, this is a whole nother discussion, and I don't want to get too far off topic, but right now, the conservation movement in Canada, the environmental movement, is not doing well at all. And there's almost like an emerging consensus across the political spectrum in Canada that we should simply develop and exploit all of our wild places. The effect of the tariffs, which has been a big deal in Canada, the tariffs, right, which is its own thing. I have a slightly different perspective on that than most Canadians, but it's kind of been seized upon as, well, now we have no choice, right? If the Americans put these tariffs in, then we'll have to clear cut every last forest. We'll have to mine out every last river. We'll have to dam everything up because we need all this for economic development now. So sadly, that was sort of an unforeseen consequence of all of that Canadian politicians are using all of these recent developments. And that's not, there are many other factors involved. The tariffs is just one. Even without the tariffs, this probably was going to happen anyways. But they're really giving the green light to let's develop every last wild place we can. Now, the good news is, and remember I said I try to give you some positive. The good news is the geography is just so vast that even going at the rate we are, there's still vast, truly vast areas across the north that are completely wild, that would look much the same today that they did 115 years ago in Darrell's day, that are still relatively untouched, where wolves and caribou and polar bears still roam free, much as they always have. And that's the hope for the future, that we can still find the will to act before it's too late and preserve some of this, if not all of what's left, which is certainly my hope. So don't give up hope yet. There's still plenty worth fighting for. And that's partly why I write these books. I think, it's an adventure story, but I'm hoping at the end of the day, people read these books and they think, wow, that was a cool adventure story. But man, the wilderness, the way he described the crackle of that campfire, the call of that loon, that haunting call echoing across some misty lake, makes me want to get outdoors. It makes me want to go to my local forest or out to my local lake. And then if enough people do that, I think gradually, step by step, more and more people will say we need to preserve these places. And that is really my hope at the end of the day, is that we just have more and more people changing their views to think, wild places are worth saving, and then we will save them.
Yeah.
because we certainly have the ability to do it. It's just a matter of political will. So that's what I'm hoping. And yeah, things aren't looking so great right now, but the final chapter is yet to be written. We can still change it and we can still save these places.
Excellent. Okay. I'm just curious. You have briefly mentioned the snake project that you're working on in Canada, and I wanted to know where are you in this process, and is this going to be a book one day? Because I love snakes, and I cannot wait to hear more about it.
Right. This is definitely not a book project. I don't know where that idea came from, but I guess people associate me with writing books about adventures, but I do many, many more adventures than I could possibly ever write about. And
Hmm.
Snakes is simply a side project of mine. I mean, I love every aspect of the wild. I've written books about birds, where the falcon flies, lost explorers, old maps, ancient forest, old growth trees. But snakes is something different. I mean, Canada is not known for snakes, right?
Hmm.
Because we're cold, and most people, when we think of Canadian wildlife, we think of beavers and moose and caribou and polar bears. But we do have snakes, and many of our snakes are rare. We don't see them very often in Canada. They're endangered, many of them. We have in Canada 33 different species of snake. Now, in the United States, you have a lot more. But I thought, wouldn't it be cool, because I often come across snakes just coincidentally when I'm out in the woods around my house or anywhere else, and I realized, I've seen 8 or 9 different species of snake just wandering around without even really trying. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool, to kind of bucket list item, if I could see every one of the 33 species of snake native to Canada in the wild before I die. So I started doing that just as a fun little side project, the Great Canadian Snake Quest. And now I'm up to 20 different species of snake.
Wow.
Yes, I got a lot in a short amount of time, but I'm kind of slowing down because now the ones that I don't have are the ones that are a lot farther from where I live or harder to find. But that's not a bad tally, 20 of 33. And yeah, it's really just a project I was doing for my own curiosity. I mean, I'm curious about everything. I look for ancient forests, as we're saying, old trees, rocks, waterfalls, you name it, lost explorers. And I thought, why not snakes? And the cool thing about snakes is it's something that no matter where anyone lives, it's something you can search for pretty much anywhere. You could live in Detroit, Chicago, Toronto, even in a big city. Not very far away, you're going to find snakes. And I thought this is a cool way to get kids into the environment, into endangered species, into conservation. Everyone knows like familiar snakes like rattlesnakes and garter snakes, but I wanted to bring the other ones like queen snakes and red-bellied snakes or smooth green snakes a little more attention, in the hopes again of inspiring a little bit of adventure, a little bit of a desire and urge among especially school kids, get outdoors, look for these things, and then hopefully in doing so learning a little bit more about what threatens their habitat, why are they endangered, and maybe what we could do to help them. So that's just a side project of mine. I do have a book I'm working on right now. I have to actually get on top of that, which is a children's book,
Ooh.
which is coming out in the spring of 2027. And it's going to be all about getting kids into exploring the great outdoors, the wonders of nature. So that is actually going to be my next book, which is quite different, but still about my love of wild places and wildlife. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I definitely want you back in a couple of years when that one comes out because I'm a former children's librarian. I promote children's books all the time. I have little ones in my life who I take to, we have a nature preserve here and we go out there all the time. And I think that will be a fantastic book to celebrate as well. So,
Right. Yeah. Well, if I can get people in the US to read the book, that would be fantastic. Because for the most part, I always think it's a novelty to talk to an American about any of my books because they're pretty Canadian, right? Like in Canada, yeah, I do a lot of Canadian events and I'm on the Canadian bestseller list. But still, I think in the US, I'm not nearly even 1/100th as well known. People there, I don't really think of them as reading my books, but it's always nice to hear, oh yes, in Michigan I have a reader, right? So that's nice. And certainly when that kids book comes out, I want it to be. It's not strictly a Canadian book. That book is more of a written for a universal audience around the world, getting kids into nature, and it involves nature all over the world. So yeah, it would be great to reconnect when that book is published.
Yeah, and I just want to say I'm doing everything I can because I'm on TikTok, and whenever somebody says name a good nonfiction author, I always put your name in there. I always list your titles, and I've had people say, "Oh, I didn't know about this, and I'm going to read it." So I'm out there doing the Lord's work out here with
Right.
regard to the U.S.
That's the problem. You see, I don't have TikTok, so I'm not with the times. That's why no one outside of Canada knows who I am. Right. I have to get with the times.
But Adam, thank you so much for really seriously carving out time. I know you have a crazy busy schedule. I'm going to put in the show notes Adam's book tour. And so if you have an opportunity to go and see him, do so. It's just a fascinating, fun evening. And I will tell you this, by the way, Adam, I've told so many of my American friends about your books. And then I say, oh, you should go see him live. And then I think, oh, wait a minute. So is there any possibility you're ever going to come here and maybe like not here in Michigan, but in the US somewhere like Chicago or New York or LA or something and do a presentation?
Well, I certainly would do it. In fact, ironically, during the pandemic, I did do several presentations virtually for Michigan libraries.
Yes, you did.
And yeah, there was a few of them. I did one, and then it would, through the grapevine, lead to another. It always felt like. I mean, I'm certainly open to it. It's a little more complicated. There is sort of border rules about, well, you're not a citizen to come here and do a presentation. You have to fill out a little more paperwork. But I mean, I hope so. Maybe with the new children's book, because it's more of a universal book, that's a possibility. So yes, it's definitely possible. Only time will tell, though, as they say. But I would be open to it. Yes, absolutely.
Awesome.
And if not, as you just saw me a few weeks ago, I am just across the border for book events, sometimes in Sarnia and in Windsor. So I'm not that far away. Oh, and actually, since we are talking Michigan, I'm actually doing a talk very soon. Let me look at my calendar. In 3 days in Sault Ste. Marie, Canada. But of course, there's Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, just across the border from Michigan. So literally, you could throw a rock and you'd be across the river in Canada. So I am in Sault Ste. Marie on Wednesday night. I don't know if the podcast will come out before that. I do think that event's almost sold out, but that is pretty close, obviously, to Michigan, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, anyway, thank you so much, Adam. I really appreciate being able to talk with you again today, and we will see you in a couple of years for the children's book.
Yeah, 18 months, even faster.
Oh, there you go. 18 months. Sounds good. All right. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much for having me on the show again, Rebecca.
Happy reading, everyone.
Thank you for joining us on our bookish journey. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing Canada Reads American Style wherever you listen. You can connect with the podcast and Rebecca on Instagram at Canada Reads American Style and with Tara at On a Branch Reads. Until next time, keep reading.